It's such a pleasure to be here with you, Yuji. I'm going to start with a question that's not a question. You are the son of the Shelby Foote, but he was just Shelby Foote or dad to you, is that right?
That's correct, yeah.
Good, good. So what was it like? I mean, you told me that you grew up basically while he was working on the Centennial series. What's your perspective on that?
Well, he was writing about the Battle of Gettysburg when I was born. But I just want to start, first of all, just by saying what an honor it is to be here at Gettysburg. We had to drive around the battlefield before heading over here, and I was remembering times with my dad here, and so it's bittersweet to revisit places you've been with people who are no longer with us. And it's just to be, this day is a magical thing for me. I'm so glad to be with you all today. But your question about what it was like being in the house with someone who's writing the Civil War, a narrative in a room in the back over the garage, was, I realized at the time, now looking back, it was a unique experience. But to me, it was just what home life was. But I have a little, an excerpt from a letter here, and please let me know if I don't move away from this microphone, just holler at me. My mother sent me this letter in April of 1986, and as you know, this Burns series premiered in 1990. I was living in New York City at the time. So here's a quote from a letter she sent me. Daddy has gone to Shiloh with the Burns brothers, who are making a documentary on the Civil War. They did a fine show on the Statue of Liberty and on the Brooklyn Bridge, and also on Huey Long, which hasn't aired yet. They do good work. And then she goes on to tell me some of the latest news of my old high school friends. And but she did, you know, my dad was occasionally interviewed by one person or another, but it wasn't something that they would mention to me in their correspondence. She saw that something special was happening here and went into the detail of, to say they do good work. I think she had an inkling of maybe what was to come, but I guess none of us knew how, you know, the 60 million people would tune in. But the thing that, you know, it isn't just for this event that I've been revisiting a lot of my dad's, you know, my thoughts about my father. I guess anyone in here who's of a certain age knows that there's a point in your life where you can look back and see your parents not as mom and dad, but as fully formed people, and ask yourself, who were they? And in my dad's case, that's been a fascinating sort of project for the last 6 or 8 years. But one tool I have that not most people don't is that I have hours of taped interviews conducted by Ken Burns as a reference, and so it's funny, you know, Ken captured the person in those interviews really is the man that was at the dinner table every night, and it's funny because when I'm watching him, I can almost smell my dad's pipe smoke, which was, he had a pipe going at all times. And the thing that amazed me watching them is that Ken got him to put his pipe down long enough to talk. I mean, I'm surprised he wasn't puffing away on camera. I remember asking my dad, watching that, I called him after the first night. I was in New York watching it, and said, how do you remain so calm, cool, and collected in front of the cameras like that? And I guess I could take this advice here today. He said, well, son, I know my subject. And it was not a bad, simple answer to that. But anyway, so I'm excited to see starting this evening, to see him on the big screen at the Majestic. That's going to be, I've experienced it really, as far as I know, no one's had yet. That film hasn't been screened in a proper cinema, only on video, so.
Well, I think we just got maybe as close as we're going to get to hear you imitate your dad's voice. Did it not sound a little bit? He switched his voice a little bit to get into it.
It was there, yeah.
So when he was working on, let's stick with the trilogy, you know, or the book series for now. When he was working on that, what sort of What was he like? Was he accessible dad? Was he serious? How was he?
Well, I think to talk about the trilogies is a good idea, but it makes sense to kind of go back a little bit and tell you a little bit about what, in his literary life, what led up to that. As far as being around the house, it was a sort of sacred time. My dad kept regular office hours, unlike a lot of writers who might just work in the morning and take the afternoon off. He had a note by the phone, which was, this dates me, but it was a rotary phone that was attached to the wall, and it had a long cord that was always tangled. I'm sure some of us remember those. And the little typewritten note there that said, Mr. Foote, this is what was to be read should anyone call for him. And it was, Mr. Foote is not to be disturbed and may be available after 5 p.m. He took a midday break each day at exactly the same time and came out and made himself a simple lunch, often of Vienna sausages and head lettuce, but going back, I mean, my dad was a person that was from a unique background. He was a native of the Mississippi Delta and grew up in Greenville, born in 1916, and took me down to Greenville often in my youth. He really wanted to impart to me a feeling of connection to that place and those people. As some of you may know, the Mississippi Delta is also a sort of haunted place that the bottom has sort of fallen out of it. So Greenville, in my dad's youth, was what some called the Athens of the South, and produced many great writers. Why? And someone asked him, why does Greenville have so many great writers? There's Walker Percy, Ellen Douglas, Harding Carter, Pulitzer Prize winner. And he said, the answer is very simple. If Will Percy had lived in Oxford, then all the writers would come from Oxford. That's not a very good example because a lot of writers do, but I should have picked a more obscure place for that. But yeah, Will Percy was a Greenvillian, lived there, and my dad, was 16 or so when he came over to my father at the Greenville Country Club and said, I have a nephew that I'm adopting, and he's going to be moving here to Greenville. Would you consider just showing him around, helping him get acquainted? And that person was Walker Percy, and my father and Walker had a lifelong friendship that spanned 54 years or something, and is reflected beautifully in a book that's still available, The Correspondence of Shelby Foote and Walker Percy. If anybody in here is interested in taking a course in writing or wants to know how to write, that book's not a bad text guide on how that could go. But so Will Percy, the reason he pointed to him as being the inspiration for this fertile literary ground is that Will Percy was a well-traveled man, had lived in Japan, was a published author and poet, and had a vast library with all the important books in it, which my father would later accumulate in his accumulation of books, essentially kind of replicated, I think, and I now have my dad's library around me and at my home, and still nurturing me. But so Will Percy, and that house was he was host to any important writer that was going to come through that part of the world would pass through that Percy household. So when Walker and he became friends, as Will had asked him to sort of take him around, my dad ended up becoming a sort of a fixture in that house as well. And they built model airplanes together upstairs. And I've heard funny stories. There's the nephew of Walker's nephew told me a story recently that he said that they were the older guys that were and he used to follow them around, the way we all kind of admire our older brothers and things, and at one point they stopped letting him join them in a certain room in the house, and he would go up there and knock on the door and say, can I come in? And they would say, no, go away, you can't come in here right now. And he said he was just heartbroken. Eventually, after a couple of months, they finally opened the door and let him in, and they had built him a beautiful model airplane. I don't know what plane, but these were the old kits with the balsa wood and the rice paper. Anyway, so my dad was exposed to that library. He said that Will Percy was somebody that, if he read you a passage from a book, that you would want to run home and read that entire book, and in fact, continue reading until you read every book that author had written. He inspired, and it's funny. I've seen. I have a friend. It's kind of crossover on the next story I was going to tell. You asked me what it's like being in the house while my dad's downstairs writing the trilogy, the Civil War trilogy. Here's an excerpt from a letter my dad sent me in college, and I had stayed in Memphis for all of high school and left for college in 1980. And he said, I was a freshman when he wrote me this. "We miss you very much, of course, not least the jarring thump of rock and roll directly above our pillowed heads." And that reminded me of the fact, and these are letters that I've only revisited in the past year. They were in a shoebox, and I had fortunately saved a lot of the letters, not all that my father had written to me over the years. They're all written in this calligraphic script that Ken mentioned. My dad wrote every single manuscript for every book he published. It would start with him at his desk using a dip pen of the type that existed in post offices when he was a boy. And you had to have a blotter and pad what you'd written to dry it. And that's how the letters that he sent me are. So they're kind of treasures in that way. So that thing he mentioned about rock and roll directly above their pillowed heads, in other words, my room was just upstairs. And some of you may know the writer Hampton Sides, who's published a lot of narrative history, much in the same style as my father's writing. And Hampton and I were in a band together in high school, and we used to rehearse at the house in that room upstairs. And he was piano, I was on guitar. Neither of us continued our musical careers, but Hampton told me this funny story about being up there, and we had our amplifiers turned up. We were experimenting with Hendrix-style feedback techniques and things, and there was this pounding on the door, and the door flung open, proceeded by my father was preceded by, as always, a cloud of pipe smoke, and he was just like he wasn't furious, but he was pretty agitated. He said, "Turn that down. I'm trying to write Appomattox here." and we all looked at each other with the question in our minds: what the hell is Appomattox? What's he talking about? So anyway, that's, yeah.
For what it's worth, when I first saw that word, I thought it was Appomattox, and there was nobody around me in Chicago to tell me that it wasn't Appomattox. So there you go. I think you once told me that your dad, that his entry into writing, he thought that being a literary intellectual, knowing the great works would make him a better writer. Is that right?
Yes. I think in a sense, my father's, one of his contributions to literature, American literature, is that he originated the technique of using fictional techniques for history, and it was a sort of what they called new journalism at a certain point. Let me see if I can find another little quote here.
Oh, I'm going out of order.
Yeah, no, that's perfectly fine. He brought fictional technique to nonfiction subjects, and elevated history to the level of history and biography to the level of literature in doing so. But I think my father, his primary, he had source material for his Civil War, which were original documents and letters and newspapers, and but his schooling came not by studying history academically. It was by reading Proust, and there's a long list of authors, Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, and in fact he said, and I just made some notes here, that if to understand the psychology of his characters, you'd visit Dostoevsky. looking for writing skill, you'd go to Tolstoy, and if you were going to develop characters, you'd study Dickens, for example. And yeah, Ken mentioned this. My dad embarked on becoming a writer, having met this Will Percy and seen what a writer looked like and how they, moved around in a room. Can be enough inspiration to set you on your course, and I think that's sort of what happened for him. So he had published 5 novels by the time his best friend Walker Percy published his first. Walker Percy's first being The Moviegoer, which won the National Book Award. And I can only imagine how my dad must have felt when his best friend, just as a result of contracting tuberculosis and having to drop out of medical school, writes one book and wins the National Book Award, and he's on his 5th. I'm the writer in this friendship, But yeah, he had written his 5th novel. He had no intention of writing nonfiction, and as Ken mentioned, he had written one novel, which I recommend to anyone in here who's interested in the Civil War. It's called Shiloh, and it's the battle told through from the point of view. Each chapter is the point of view of a different person participating in the battle, and I think it's still one of the greatest novels about the Civil War that's been written. And he had written that, and as a result, it was the 100th anniversary of the Civil War, the Centennial, and Bennett Cerf, who was the head of Random House at the time, called my dad and asked him if he would be willing to write a short synopsis of the American Civil War to be published at the time of the Centennial. And he agreed to do so, and he was 37 years old at the time, and little did he know he'd be busy working on that trilogy until he was 56. He started it in 54 and ended it in the spring of 74. I was born in 61, which is how I ended up kind of in the middle there at the Battle of Gettysburg at my inception. But it was, this massive trilogy of 1.5 million words, and he used to proudly say, and Proust remembers some things past, only has 1.2 million, so he surpassed Proust in that regard. But yeah, so it was kind of a happy accident that he got steered into this thing, and I think as many people that are here today know, the Civil War, once you kind of wade into those waters, it can consume you. And I just have to say, my first introduction to Gary was, this man knows more about the American Civil War than any human alive. So
That's not true.
I'm honored to be on this stage with Gary today. Anyway.
Thanks, Eugene, and for the kind words. I do want to make sure we talk about Ken Burns' series, of course, that which made him a millionaire.
Yes.
Your father as well. But you told me also that you've been re-engaging with your father's prose, and I think you might have an insight on that none of us could possibly have. So what's that been like?
It's been a great pleasure. I mentioned those 5 novels that preceded the trilogy, and there's one more called September that followed it. They're amazing novels, all set in the Mississippi Delta in a fictional place, much like Faulkner's Yoknapatawpha. And he was, trying to understand this strange and haunted place that he came from. And so my experiences, for example, it's all this is looking back. He would put me in the car, and sometimes my mother would join us. She called it visiting the dead on those trips, because we would always stop at the various ancestral graves along Highway 61 on the way down there. There's a foot plot in Rolling Fork, Mississippi. And if you know the Delta, these are all strange and mysterious sort of outposts, is how these places feel. And so, yeah, now when I read him and I hear his voice as I read, I understand where he came from now in a way that I hadn't before. The last 7 years, thanks randomly to a friend who started doing a tamale festival in my dad's hometown of Greenville in an attempt to revive it and bring people there, I've started going there, and I hadn't been since going with my father, really, other than just down to hear some blues every now and then, somewhere dipping south of Memphis into Mississippi a little. But I started spending these series of days with Julia, the tamale festival person, and I walked into the first gathering I attended there. This man came up eager to chat, and he told me, I sold your father his first car. You know, turns out his family had the Cadillac dealership, and he would get a free one every year, the son of the dealer, Cadillac dealer, and he would and my dad bought his used previous year's model. And so just being embraced down there as a sort of it was something that come full circle. I think my father would be glad to see happening for me, because he wanted me to feel a connection to my roots, his roots, you know.
Good. I've heard some stories. So before Ken Burns, but after the book comes out, your dad has a certain amount of interest. 30,000 books, not bad at all. So he's got interested. I've heard a couple of stories. I don't think it's mercurial, but I've heard that he wasn't crazy about signing people's books if he didn't know them. Do you know anything about that?
I do know about that. I witnessed the disappointment as it would fall over the faces of people who would come with books for him to sign. And he basically said, I don't sign books except for close friends and or family, because I don't, otherwise it would be meaningless. My signature in a book would become meaningless. And maybe that was just an excuse. He was just trying to spare himself. But it's kind of extraordinary. My dad never, you know, in today's world, an artist is not solely, but in large part responsible for their own self-promotion and social media. I mean, my fellow artists are, you know, operating an ongoing daily self-promotion via their Instagram feeds. And my dad came from that, you know, but there was a time previously when artists were supposed to just kind of hover in the background and be mysterious people that couldn't be reached. And then someone else would be out front doing all the PR. But my dad, I mean, just his writing, this is hard to imagine for me, but so his workroom back there, which I thought was what writers, how they worked, he had no secretary, no anyone around. He was back there alone. And, you know, in our family, I was an only child of my mother and father. They had previous marriages, but they were married for over 50 years. And so I was kind of the only person other than them in the house. So, you know, I knew to stay out of that area of the house when he was working. He wouldn't throw anything at me, but he would come close if I lingered too long back there. But yeah, so he never engaged in any real form of self-promotion. He had an agent that was, you know, reviewing contracts and things, but he never called them and said, I've got a novel coming out, tell me about what's the plan for publicity, you know. He never did a single book tour. He never was at a bookstore signing books. He would speak, but so I just thought it was an incredible experience. My mother and I talked about this not long after the Burns series came out. Our lives were greatly changed. You know, if we were in New York having dinner, the chef, the owner of the restaurant would come out and say that the meal's on complimentary. We're honored to have you here. People would stop him in the street and he enjoyed every bit of that. So through no fault of his own, he received the acclaim and recognition that I think he hoped for and I feel deserved as an author. And not only was the trilogy selling at the rate like that Ken mentioned, all of the novels, some of which had previously been out of print, but were brought back into print and sell well as well. And those are all available to this day through Random House and on Amazon and et cetera, which is, you know, I can't imagine any author that wouldn't hope for that. It's a legacy. So.
I can't even tell you how many times, you know, working at the American Battlefield Trust, we run into a lot of young budding historians and a lot of people who are older who like to tell their origin story, and how many people got interested in the Civil War because of your father's work. Mm-hmm. It happens a lot, both from interns and from a couple of board members, as a matter of fact. Mm-hmm. Before we move on to Ken, one last thing. You know, I know your dad took breaks. He said he broke for lunch, but he also watched some TV with your mom. And of course, we all like to think about how, you know, it must have been Gunsmoke or some sort of a war show, or it must have been about history or something like that. But no, what was it? What show did he watch?
my mother and father would meet at noon to watch As the World Turns religiously. And my father, I would occasionally wander in there, and because of the pipe smoking, literally, I don't know if you've ever been in an enclosed space where someone's heavily smoking a pipe, but the smoke settles at about 5 feet off the ground in a thick plane of smoke. It's like cannon smoke, across the room. And I would go in there, and the smoke would hit you here and kind of waft around you as you came in. I don't know how my mother stood it all those years, but and I'd sit down on the edge of the bed. My dad would be there, having finished his lunch, usually reclining sort of in a sharpshooter position with the pipe in hand and watching very intently as whatever unfolded on As the World Turns. And I remember at one point he would, every now and then, he'd take his pipe and point to the screen and say, "You see the grandmother back there who's arranging flowers? I remember when she was a young woman having an affair with a school teacher." Like, they watched it for over 30 years, and those actors remain on the show for all that time. And I'm happy to say that thanks to Ken, my dad was invited to visit the set of As the World Turns in New York on one of his trips. Celebrity has its perks. But unfortunately, when he went, none of the old crew were filming that day. It was a the next generation, so he didn't get to meet his old friends.
Well, I know if I ever hit the big time, I'm going to the As the World Turns set. That's going to be
That's
first
where you
on
want to
my
be.
list.
Yeah.
So you already sort of teed it up at the beginning, sharing some of your mom's words about the sort of preconception of the Ken Burns series. He was going to shoot this interview, and they do good work. Could you sort of pick it up from there? Did your dad talk about it before it came out?
I think my father knew that something important was happening. He did tell me, and I mentioned that he had never done anything to promote himself or never push people. But he said, I only did it once in my life. And I called my editor at Random House, who was Robert Loomis, who's no longer with us, unfortunately. And he told him, this series is about to air, and I think you might want to order some extra copies of the book. They did, but they quickly ran out 2 months after the series and there was a little gap there, and then plenty of books came in and they were able to catch up. But, I mean, I don't think anybody could really have known. But, there's something I've been reading over the past week is there are excerpts of the trilogy, which is, as I say, 1.5 million words in 3 volumes. 2 books were published. One is called Stars in Their Courses, and it's the Gettysburg chapter of the trilogy as a freestanding piece of writing. They just pulled it out and put it between covers and stuff. And I just finished it, and it's the first time I've read those chapters in that volume as opposed to coming upon them as I read through the trilogy. And I recommend that book to all the Gettysburg fans. It puts you in the midst of it all in a way that I guess my dad's work is famous for, but it's true. The hair stands up on the back of your neck, and there's a feeling. And then also there's another volume like that of the Vicksburg campaign called "The Beleaguered City." It's an introduction to my dad's nonfiction. Those aren't bad choices, I personally would recommend just embarking on the trilogy, starting with page 1, and then it's really. I've mentioned my dad's inspiration having been so much all these great authors that he revered. It's also he had a very disciplined. He was utterly self-taught. He went to college, but sort of by accident. His best friend Walker went to Chapel Hill, and my dad he left Greenville. My dad applied, but was rejected, and he later found out that the principal of his high school in Greenville had sent a letter warning Chapel Hill not under no circumstances accept this student into your school, because my dad had made fun of him. He was editor of the high school newspaper, which won national awards apparently. These writers, and he had made fun of that principal and said things that man didn't like. So he got his revenge by sending that letter. But it was the bottom of the Depression, and my dad just got in his car and drove up there. And he said, "I'm here. I'd like to attend." And he said, "I'm sorry, we told you not to come. You're not accepted." And he said, "Well, I'm here, So maybe we could continue the conversation. And they admitted him that day. That was you. You could do that back then. In the bottom of the Depression, there were probably some empty seats in those classrooms.
So he was as charming as he is on the show. It would
Perhaps,
appear.
yes, that's a good point. So he famously, he didn't stay in that school for long. He was there for less than a year and a half. He said, I basically didn't really attend any classes that didn't interest me, and I mainly was. He said a school is just a bunch of buildings surrounding a library. That was what a college campus was for him, and he just lived in the library in those stacks of books. And I think his words, a cult in clover, in those stacks.
So you, famous people say, after they've achieved real fame, that you have no idea. You just have no idea. So even though your dad knew something was coming, maybe, how did he deal with, I mean, I've read newspaper stories about marriage proposals, and you're an older guy by then. You're not a kid anymore by the time Ken Burns comes out. What was that like for you and for him when this maelstrom hit?
It's funny. My dad didn't change at all. Grab this before it flies.
Oh, don't get him out of order.
He did two things. What did he do? He bought he told me the first time he ever sold a piece of writing was something to the Saturday Evening Post, and he was paid by the word, and he got a check for $700 or something. This is way back before ever starting the trilogy. And he went out and bought himself a shotgun, a leather jacket, and a lamp to hang above his desk. And then he thought, I'm in the game now. I'm just gonna write words and get paid for them, and that's gonna be the story of my life. He didn't know it could be a little more challenging than that. So fame, as far he did go out and get himself a BMW convertible, and but I remember my mother saying, she pointed out to me, I was like, this fame has gone to Dad's head. She said, we're just lucky he's not laid up at the plaza with a couple of hookers. That was my mother's sense of humor. I mean, my dad didn't, everything stayed the same. He kept his same routine. He was, began to see there were a lot of awards and a lot of attention. He was on The Tonight Show. He was on Dick Cavett, that sort of thing. But he just, I don't know, I can't say exactly what it meant to him. I think what mattered the most to him was that his books were widely read and he was appreciated as an author. The rest of it all didn't seem to make much difference to him, I think. And I know that sounds like a sort of flattering thing to say about him, but it didn't change his life much. He didn't go out and put himself in situations where he could be in the spotlight unless he was invited. So.
Well, we're running out of time, and I want to make sure you get time to tell any other stories that you want to, but first just burning for me.
Sure.
And by the way, I think Yuji said that after we're done, he'd be happy to take questions offline afterward if you have some, not up in this format. But I just got to know, I mean, when people find out that you're Shelby Foote's son, or Shelby Foote was your dad, I mean, do they quote his Ken Burns lines to you? Because I've got 10 in my mind right now.
Yes.
I mean, as a battlefield guide here, run old hair. I mean, it comes up on tour. So does this happen to you?
It's funny. I just read that line from the trilogy yesterday. I think it's a pleasure. This is just me probably speaking as the son. If we're the son of a father, and there were a lot on stage today, who casts a long shadow, you find yourself, trying to get out from under that shadow and find out who you are and stake your place in the world. As one friend of mine recently said, someone said he was the son of he's a rabbi who was the son of a prominent Memphian, and he said someone told him, you've got some big shoes to fill, and he said, no, I have my own shoes to fill, which is, so for a long time, for example, I went to college in New York, where probably people knew him less, and this was prior to the Ken Burns thing, but he was already a famous author, certainly in my hometown, and I ended up living in France and England and places where they wouldn't have a clue who my dad was even after the Ken Burns series came out. Whether that's a coincidence, I mean, those are good places to be regardless, but today, it's come full circle. And there was a moment where I had to step into the simple truth of, I am my father's son. And that has been a pleasure. And most of the encounters I've had are people that want to tell me how much they meant to him, and that they just want to share how much they enjoyed his work and his presence in the series. And that's most people, and I'm sure the people in this room are included, are pretty. It's a pretty good crowd. It's a nice group of people. The Ken Burns, Shelby Foote, the people that might want to talk about those people are. I could not much riffraff in this crew.
I agree.
Some, but
There's a few in this room right now.
Yeah.
I see 3 of them, as a matter of fact. Let me just give you the opportunity. Is there anything else you'd like to add that you think the group would like to know before we wrap up?
Rather than share another story, which I have many, made some notes here. I wrote 3 quotes from my dad. In a letter to Walker, he wrote, "Over 2 million words between covers." That's including the novels and the trilogy. "Staggering to contemplate, enough to make you get under a rug and hide from having perpetrated that huge of an outrage on the world." And another quote something he said, "I'd be willing to put a stake ahead of my art 3 times a week, but unfortunately, I can't afford it." That changed with Ken's film. And finally, and this really sums up my dad's sort of spiritual life, society is frivolous. Salvation lies in art, which can save us from the complications of living and dying. And that was true for him. He built a temple, surrounded himself. I started just to mention the influence of music on his writing. The passages, as you read through them, it takes the 450 pages that it takes to get to an event are in the sense of, it's symphonic, in the sense that you couldn't just drop the needle on the 3rd movement of a Mozart symphony and experience that passage in the same way as you would as if you'd sat down and listened to the movements leading up to that point. And it's true of serious literature, and it's an art that may soon be gone, that hopefully people will still see some sense in sitting down and reading something that's 400 or, not to mention 1,500 pages long. So his study of music is all I meant. Is he really listened, and there are charts of his musical library. I have I have his LP collection. Inside, as you pull out a record, there's just notes, handwritten notes about everything. He studied that music, all classical, mixed in with a lot of his Delta blues favorites. He studied that music as deeply and as diligently as he did any of the great books that inspired him. So that, I think he knew that writing is about finding the rhythm and cadence of things. I loved what Ken said before, that when writers die, they hope to go to heaven as musicians. That makes perfect sense to me.
Good. Well, any last ones? You looked back down, or not? Because I was going to wrap it up.
I think I might be done. Let me turn the page here.
It's a page turner. Sorry.
I think that's kind of. There's nothing funny I need to add. I think I'm done, y'all.
Eugene, thank you so much, and thank you all for being the smart ones who won't have such a crowded museum ahead of you. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Gary. Real pleasure.
Thank you.